In the summer of 1209, a massive army of crusaders surrounded the prosperous town of Béziers in southern France. The soldiers weren't fighting Muslims in the Holy Land, they were hunting Christians. Inside the walls, thousands of Catholics and members of a breakaway sect called the Cathars huddled together, praying for mercy. When the gates fell, a soldier allegedly asked the papal legate how to distinguish the heretics from the faithful. His response became one of history's most chilling commands: kill them all. God will know his own. In the massacre that followed, up to 20,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered, burned alive in churches, rather than renounce their faith. For over a century, the Cathars had flourished across southern France, building a parallel church with its own priests, its own theology, and its own vision of salvation. But by 1244, after the fall of their last fortress at Montségur and the burning of 220 believers on a massive pyre, they were nearly extinct, crushed not just by armies, but by the newly created Inquisition that hunted survivors for generations. Were the Cathars really a dangerous suicide cult threatening Christian civilization? Or were they peaceful dualists destroyed for political power in their land? Welcome to the channel, Cult Files. Today we're investigating the Cathars, medieval France's most controversial heretical movement, a sect that terrified the Catholic Church so deeply it launched the first crusade against fellow Christians and invented the Inquisition to finish the job. If you're here for forbidden religious history that questions official narratives and digs into the evidence behind one of Europe's bloodiest religious persecutions, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an investigation. This story has theological debates, castle sieges, mass burnings, and a final plot twist that will make you question whether the Cathars were victims or willing participants in their own destruction. Let's begin. Our story begins not in France, but with an ancient theological problem that had haunted Christianity for centuries. If God is all good and all-powerful, why does evil exist? The Cathars, whose name comes from the Greek katharoi, meaning the pure ones, had a radical answer. They were dualists, believing that two equal cosmic forces rule reality: a good God who created the spiritual realm of light, souls, and heaven, and an evil God, often identified with Satan or the Old Testament Yahweh, who created the material world of flesh, suffering, and death. Everything physical was evil. The body was a prison. Sex was sin. Childbirth trapped new souls in matter, and the entire visible world was Satan's kingdom. Salvation meant escaping the material trap through rigorous asceticism, rejecting marriage and procreation, and ultimately achieving spiritual purity that would free the soul from the cycle of reincarnation. Yes, Cathars believed in reincarnation and return it to the realm of pure light. This wasn't just abstract theology. It had radical social implications. If the material world was evil, then the Catholic Church, with its massive wealth, ornate cathedrals, corrupt clergy, and political alliances with kings, was serving the evil God, not the good one. Cathars rejected the authority of the Pope, the sacraments, the priesthood, the entire Catholic hierarchy. They had their own clergy called perfecti, the perfected ones, men and women who lived in absolute poverty, ate no meat or animal products, never touched anyone of the opposite sex, and spent their lives wandering southern France preaching and administering the consolamentum, the Cathar sacrament, a ritual laying on of hands that cleansed the soul and guaranteed salvation. Ordinary Cathar believers, called credentes, lived normal lives, worked, owned property, even ate meat, but they revered the perfecti as living saints and hoped to receive the consolamentum on their deathbeds to ensure their souls escaped the material prison. By the early 1200s, Catharism had become the dominant religion in parts of southern France, especially the Languedoc region around Toulouse, Carcassonne, and the Pyrenees. Some estimates suggest that in certain towns, half the population were Cathar believers. Nobles protected them. Towns built Cathar churches. The movement had bishops, a structured hierarchy, and diplomatic relations with other Christian sects. To the Catholic Church in Rome and the powerful kings of northern France, this was intolerable, not just theologically, but politically and economically. The wealthy, independent South was slipping away from Catholic control, and with it, taxes, tithes, and power. In 1208, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade, not against Muslims, but against the Cathars. He offered northern French nobles the same spiritual rewards as fighting in the Holy Land: forgiveness of sins, cancellation of debts, and the right to seize the lands of heretics. It was a holy war fueled by greed, and it ignited a 20-year bloodbath across southern France. The massacre at Béziers in 1209 set the tone. When Crusaders breached the walls, they didn't bother sorting Catholics from Cathars. They killed everyone, looted the town, and burned it to the ground. Chroniclers recorded that up to 20,000 died, though modern historians debate whether the famous "kill them all" quote is historical or legend. Either way, the message was clear. Resistance meant annihilation. Town after town surrendered. Nobles who protected Cathars were stripped of land. Cathar perfecti were hunted, captured, and given a choice: renounce your faith or burn. Hundreds chose the flames. Before we go deeper into the siege of Montségur and the final destruction of the Cathars, if you're finding this investigation as tragic and disturbing as we are, take a moment to subscribe to Cult Files and hit that notification bell. This kind of deep dive into religious persecution and the question of who defines dangerous cults doesn't get promoted by algorithms unless you actively support it. Your subscription matters. Let's continue. The Crusade dragged on for 2 decades, morphing from religious war into political conquest. By the 1220s, most Cathar strongholds had fallen, and the French crown absorbed the wealthy south. But pockets of resistance remained, especially in remote mountain fortresses like Montségur, a castle perched on a rocky peak in the Pyrenees, accessible only by a narrow, treacherous path. By the 1240s, Montségur had become the last major Cathar refuge, sheltering around 500 people, including over 200 perfecti, the core of the movement's clergy. The fortress was commanded by a nobleman named Raymond de Pyre, who had harbored Cathars for decades. To the Catholic authorities, Montségur was a symbol: destroy it, and you destroy Catharism forever. In May 1243, a royal army of around 10,000 soldiers laid siege to Montségur. The castle seemed impregnable: sheer cliffs on all sides, defenders who knew the terrain, and supplies stockpiled for months. But the Crusaders were patient. They built siege engines, cut off supply lines, and slowly tightened the noose. Winter came. Food ran low. Disease spread. By early 1244, after nearly 10 months of siege, the defenders negotiated surrender. The terms were brutal but clear. Ordinary soldiers and credentes would be spared if they renounced Catharism and did penance. The perfecti, the priests and priestesses, would be burned alive unless they converted to Catholicism. On March 16, 1244, a massive pyre was constructed at the base of the mountain. Around 220 Cathar perfecti were led down from the castle. Not one converted. According to chroniclers, they walked into the flames, singing hymns, choosing death over betrayal of the faith. The site is still called Camp del Cremac, the field of the burned. With Montségur's fall, organized Catharism effectively ended. Survivors went underground, hunted by the newly created Inquisition, tortured for confessions, burned in smaller pyres across southern France for the next century until the movement vanished entirely. But here's where the story gets more complicated, where we have to confront the most disturbing aspect of Cathar belief, the endura, the ritual suicide that the Catholic Church used to brand them as a death cult. The endura was a practice where a Cathar believer, usually after receiving the consolamentum, would voluntarily starve themselves to death. The logic was theological. The consolamentum cleansed the soul, but any sin committed afterward, especially eating meat, sexual contact, or violence, would undo the purification. So the safest path was to die immediately after the ritual, ensuring the soul escaped the material prison without risking new contamination. For elderly or terminally ill Cathars, the endura made a kind of tragic sense, a spiritual hospice. But the practice went further. There are documented cases of healthy people, including young adults, undergoing the consolamentum and then refusing all food until they died, sometimes taking weeks of agonizing starvation. Families would support them, sitting vigil as their loved ones slowly wasted away, viewing it as an act of ultimate purity. To Catholic authorities, this was proof that Catharism was a suicide cult, a dangerous heresy that convinced people to reject life itself. To modern observers, it's one of the most disturbing examples of religious extremism in Western history. People literally starving themselves to death for salvation. But here's the twist historians grapple with. How common was the endura really? Most of our evidence comes from Inquisition records, confessions extracted under threat of torture or death. The inquisitors had every reason to exaggerate and demonize. Some scholars argue the endura was rare, limited to extreme circumstances, and blown out of proportion by Catholic propaganda to justify the Crusade and Inquisition. Others point to multiple independent accounts, suggesting it was a genuine, if infrequent practice, that reflected the radical logic of Cathar dualism taken to its ultimate conclusion. What we know for certain is this. Catharism did reject the material world so completely that voluntary death became for some the highest spiritual act. Whether this makes them a suicide cult or martyrs for a radical theology depends on who's telling the story and what evidence you trust. The final destruction of the Cathars came not from crusader armies, but from the Inquisition, a new institution created specifically to hunt down heresy with methodical, bureaucratic efficiency. Inquisitors moved from town to town, offering amnesty to those who confessed and denounced others, and torturing or burning those who refused. They kept meticulous records. They developed psychological techniques to break resistance. By the early 1300s, organized Catharism was extinct. The last known Cathar perfectus was burned in 1321. The movement that once threatened to replace Catholicism in southern France was erased. So what have we uncovered? The Cathars were dualist heretics who rejected the material world, created a parallel church, and terrified Catholic authorities enough to launch the first crusade against fellow Christians and invent the Inquisition to finish the job. Some practiced voluntary starvation, the endura making them, in some eyes, a suicide cult. But the full picture is more complex. The Cathars also offered a critique of Catholic wealth and corruption that resonated with thousands of believers. They treated women as equals. Female perfecti had the same authority as men, unheard of in medieval Christianity. They lived in radical poverty and simplicity, while Catholic bishops lived like princes. Were they destroyed because they were genuinely dangerous, or because they threatened the church's wealth and power? The 20,000 massacred at Béziers weren't given a trial. The 220 burned at Montségur were killed for refusing to convert, not for committing crimes. The decades of inquisitorial torture that followed targeted not just heretics, but anyone who questioned authority. From the church's perspective, the Cathars were a cancer that had to be cut out. From another angle, they were a persecuted minority offering an alternative vision of Christianity, crushed by a more powerful institution unwilling to tolerate dissent. The question that haunts the Cathar story is this: when does religious devotion cross into dangerous extremism? The Cathars' willingness to die for their baileys, whether in flames at Montségur or through self-starvation via the endura, shows a level of commitment that can look either heroic or horrifying, depending on your perspective. And the church's willingness to massacre entire towns and torture confessions for generations raises its own uncomfortable questions about who the real danger was. If this investigation has made you think differently about how religious movements get labeled as cults and who has the power to enforce those labels through violence, then make sure you like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts or questions, and subscribe to Cult Files for more deep dives into the forbidden histories that challenge official narratives. What cult or secret society should we investigate next? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. This is Cult Files, signing off until the next uncomfortable truth.